A speed reading. A Brahman, Purusha, Ishvara, Maya, Prakriti, Shakti. So, that is then a supreme reality, eternal, absolute, and infinite, because it is absolute and infinite. It is in its essence indeterminable. It is indefinable and inconceivable by finite and defining mind. It is ineffable by a mind created speech. It is describable neither by our negations, neti, for we cannot limit it by saying it is not this, it is not that, nor by our affirmations, for we cannot fix it by saying it is this, it is that, et. And yet, though in this way unknowable to us, it is not altogether and in every way unknowable. It is self evident to itself, and although inexpressible, yet self evident to a knowledge by identity of which the spiritual being in us must be capable. For that spiritual being is in its essence and its original and intimate reality not other than this supreme existence, but although thus undeterminable to mind, or because of its absoluteness and infinity, we discover that this supreme and eternal infinite determines itself to our consciousness in the universe by real and fundamental truths of its being which are beyond the universe and innate or the very foundation of its existence. These truths present themselves to our conceptual cognitives as the fundamental aspects in which we see and experience the omnipresent reality. In themselves they are seized directly, not by intellectual understanding but by spiritual intuition, a spiritual experience in the very substance of our consciousness. But they can also be caught at in conception by a large and plastic idea and can be expressed in some sort by a plastic speech which does not insist too much on rigid definition or limit the wideness and subtlety of the idea. In order to express this experience of this idea with any nearness, the language has to be created which is advanced intuitively metaphysical and revealingly poetic, admitting significant and living images as the vehicle of a close suggestive and vivid indication, a language such as we find hammered out into a subtle and pregnant massiveness in the Veda and the Upanishads. In the ordinary tongue of metaphysical thought, we have to be content with a distant indication and approximation by abstractions which may still be of some service to our intellect, for it is this kind of speech which suits our method of logical and rational understanding. But if it is to be of real service, the intellect must consent to pass out of the bounds of a finite logic and accustom itself to the logic of the infinite. On this condition alone, by this way of seeing and thinking, it ceases to be paradoxical or futile to speak of the ineffable. But if we insist on applying a finite logic to the infinite, the omnipresent reality will escape us and we shall grasp instead an abstract shadow, a dead form petrified into speech, or a horned incisive graph which speaks of the reality but does not express it. Our way of knowing must be appropriate to that which is to be known. Otherwise, we achieve only distant speculation, a figure of knowledge, and not veritable knowledge. The supreme truth aspect, which thus manifests itself, it was in an eternal and infinite absolute self-existence, self-awareness, self-delight of being. This founds all things and secretly supports and pervades all things. The self-existence reveals itself again in three terms of its essential nature: a self, conscious being or spirit, and God or the divine being. The Indian terms are most satisfactory. Brahman, the reality, is the Atman, Purusha, Ishvara. For these terms grew from a root of intuition, and while they have a comprehensive preciseness or capable of a plastic application which avoids both vagueness in the use and the rigid a snare of a too limiting intellectual concept. The Supreme Brahman is that which in Western metaphysics is called the Absolute, but Brahman is at the same time the omnipresent reality in which all that is relative exists as it forms or its movements. This is an Absolute which takes all relativities in its embrace. The Upanishads affirm that all this is the Brahman, mind is Brahman, life is Brahman, matter is Brahman, uttering Vayu, the Lord of air of life. It is said, Vayu, thou art manifest Brahman, and pointing to man and the beast and bird and insect, each separately is identified with the one. O Brahman, thou art this old man and boy and this girl, this bird, this insect. Brahman is the consciousness that knows itself in all that acts. Brahman is the force that sustains the power of God and Titan and the demon, the force that acts in man and animal, and the form and images and the forms and energies of nature. Brahman is the Ananda, the secret bliss, existence which is other of our being, and without which none could breathe or live. Brahman is the inner soul in all. It has taken a form in correspondence with each created form which it inhabits. The Lord of being is that which is conscious in the conscious being, but he is also the conscious in inconscient things. The one who is master and in control of the many that are passive in the hands of force nature. He is the timeless and time, he is the space and all that is in space. He is the causality and the cause and the effect. He is the thinker and his thought, the warrior and his courage, the gambler and his dice thrower. All realities and all aspects and all semblances of the Brahman. The Brahman is the absolute, the transcendent and incommunicable, the supracosmic existence that sustains the cosmos self that upholds all things. But it is to the self of each individual. The soul or psychic entity is an eternal portion of the Ishvara. It is this supreme nature, it is his supreme nature or consciousness force that has become the living being in a world of living beings. The Brahman alone is, and is because of it all are. For all of the Brahman, this reality is the reality of everything that we see in self and nature. Brahman is the Ishvara and is the all this by his yoga maya, by the power of his consciousness, force put out in manifestation. He is the conscious being, soul, spirit, Purusha, and it is by his nature the force of his conscious self-existence that is all things. He is the Ishvara, the omniscient and omnipresent, all ruler, and it is by his Shakti, his conscious power, that he manifests himself in time and governs the universe. These and similar statements taken together are all comprehensive. It is possible for the mind to cut and select, to build a closed system and explain away all that does not fit within it. But it is on the complete and many-sided statement that we must take out our stand if we have to acquire an integral knowledge, an absolute, eternal and infinite self-existence, self-awareness, self-delight of being, the secretly supports and pervades the universe even while it is also beyond it, is stand the first truth of spiritual experience. But this truth of being as advanced and impersonal and a personal aspect, it is not only existence, it is the one being absolute, eternal and infinite, as there are three fundamental aspects in which we meet the reality: a self, conscious being or spirit, and God, the divine being, or to use the Indian terms, absolute and omnipresent reality, Brahman, manifest to us as Atman, Purusha, Ishvara. As so too its power of consciousness appears to us in three aspects. It is the self force of that consciousness, a conceptually creative of all things, Maya. It is Prakriti, nature or force made dynamically executive, walking out all things under the witnessing eye of the conscious being. The self or spirit, it is a conscious power of the divine being, Shakti, which is both conceptual, creative, and dynamically executive of all the divine workings. These three aspects are the powers based and comprise the whole of existence and all nature, and taken together as a single whole, they reconcile and the apparent disparateness and incompatibility of the supercosmic transcendence, the cosmic universality and the separate universe of our individual existence. The absolute cosmic nature and ourselves are linked in oneness by this triune aspect of one reality. For taken by itself, the existence of the Absolute, the Supreme Brahman, would be a contradiction of the relative universe, and our own real existence would be incompatible with its sole incommunicable reality. But the Brahman is at the same time omnipresent in all relativities. It is absolute, independent of all relatives, the absolute basing all relatives, the absolute governing, pervading, constituting all relatives. There is nothing that is not the omnipresent reality. It is in observing the triple aspect and the triple power we come to see how this is possible. If you look at this picture of the self-existence, it works as a unitary, unlimited whole of vision. It stands together and imposes itself by its convincing totality. But to the analysis of the logical intellect, it offers an abundance of difficulties, such as all attempts to erect a logical system out of a perception of an illimitable existence must necessarily create. For any such endeavor must either affect consistency by an arbitrary sectioning of the complex truth of things, or else by its comprehensiveness become logically untenable. For we say that the indeterminable determines itself as a finite and infinite and infinite. The immutable admits a constant mutability and endless differences. The one becomes an innumerable multitude. The impersonal creates or supports personality, is itself a person. The self has a nature and is yet other than its nature. A being turns into becoming, and yet it is always itself and other than its becoming. So universal individualizes itself, and the individual universes himself. Brahman is at once God of qualities and capable of infinite qualities, the Lord and doer of works, yet a non-doer and a silent witness of the workings of nature. If you look carefully at these workings of nature, once we put aside the veil of familiarity and our unthinking acquiescence in the process of things as natural, because so they always happen, we discover that all she does in whole or in parts is a miracle, an act of some incomprehensible magic. The being of the self-existence and the world that has appeared in it, or each of them and both together, a supra-rational mystery that seems to us to be a reason in things, because the processes of the physical finite are consistent to our view and the fundamental determinable and the law determinable. But this reason in things, one closely examines, seems to stumble at every moment against the irrational or infra-rational and the supra-rational. The consistency, the determinability of process seems to lessen rather than increase as we pass from matter to life and from life to mentality. If the finite concept to some extent to look as if it were rational, the infinitesimal refuses to be bound by the same laws and the infinite is unseizable. As for the action of the universe and its significance, it escapes us altogether. It's if self, God or spirit there be, is dealings with the world and us are incomprehensible, offer no clue that we can follow. God or nature and even ourselves move in a mysterious way which is only partially and at points intelligible, but as a whole escapes our comprehension. All the works of Maya look like production of a supra-rational magical power which arranges things according to its wisdom of or its fantasy. But a wisdom which is not ours and a fantasy which baffles our imagination. A spirit that manifests things or manifests itself in them so obscurely looks to our reason like a magician and his power or Maya creative magic, but magic can create illusions or it can create astounding realities, and we find it difficult to decide which of these supra-rational processes faces us in this universe. But in fact, the cause of this impression must necessarily be sought not in anything illusory or fantastic in the supreme or universal self-existence, but in our own inability to seize the supreme clue to its manifold existence or discover the secret plan and pattern of its action. The self-existence is the infinite, and its way of being out of action must be the way of the infinite. Whatever consciousness is limited, our reason built upon things finite, it is irrational to suppose that a finite consciousness and reason can be a measure of the infinite. This smallness cannot judge that immensity. This poverty bound to a limited use of its scanty means cannot conceive the opulent management of these riches. An ignorant of knowledge cannot follow the motions of an all knowledge. Our reasoning is based upon our experience of the finite operation of the physical nature, on an incomplete observation and uncertain understanding of something that acts within limits. It has organized on that basis certain conceptions which it seeks to make general and universal, and whatever contradicts or departs from this conception it regards as irrational, false, or inexplicable. But there are different orders of the reality, and the conceptions measure standards suitable to one need not be applicable to another order. Our physical being is built up first upon an aggregate of infinitesimals, electrons, atoms, molecules, cells, but the law of action of these infinitesimals does not explain all the physical workings even of the human body, much less can they cover all the law and process of action of man's supraphysical parts, his life movements and mind movements and soul movements. In the body, finites have been formed with their own habits, properties, characteristic ways of action. The body itself is a finite which is not a mere aggregate of the smaller finites, which it uses as parts, organs, constituent instruments of its operations. It has developed a being and has a general law which surpasses its dependence upon these elements or constituents. The life and mind again are supraphysical finites with a different and more subtle mode of operation of their own, and no dependence on the physical parts for instrumentation can annul their intrinsic character. There is something more and the other in our vital and mental being and vital and mental forces than the functioning of a physical body. But again, each finite is in its reality or as behind is it an infinite which is built and supports and directs the finite it has made as its self figure, so that even the being and law and process of the finite cannot be totally understood without a knowledge of that which is occult within or behind it. Our finite knowledge, conception, standards may be valid within the limits, but they are incomplete and relative. A law founded upon an observation of what is divided in space and time cannot be confidently applied to the being and action of the indivisible. Not only it cannot be applied to the spaceless and timeless infinite, but it cannot be applied even to the time infinite or a space infinite. A law and process binding for our superficial being need not be binding on what is occult within us. Again, our intellect, founding itself on reason, finds it difficult to deal with what is infrarational. Life is infrarational, and we find that our intellectual reason, applying itself to life, is constantly forcing upon it a control, a measure, an artificial Procrustean rule that either succeeds in killing or petrifying life or constrains it into rigid forms and conventions that lame and imprison its capacity or ends by a bungle, a revolt of life, a decay or disruption of the system and superstructures built upon it by our intelligence. An instinct, an intuition is needed which the intellect has not at its command and does not always listen to when it comes in of itself to help the mental working. But still more difficult must it be for our reason to understand and deal with the suprarational. The suprarational is the realm of the spirit, and in the largeness, subtlety, profundity, complexity of its movement, the reason is lost. Here, intuition and inner experience alone are the guides, or if there is any other, it is that of which intuition is only a sharp edge, an intense projected ray. The final enlightenment must come from the suprarational truth consciousness, from a supramental vision and knowledge. But the being and action of the infinite must not therefore regarded as if it were a magic void of all reason. And that is, on the contrary, a greater reason in all the operations of the infinite. But it is not a mental or intellectual, it is a spiritual and supramental reason. And there is a logic in it, because there are relations and connections infallibly seen and executed. What is the magic to our finite reason is the logic of the infinite. It is a greater reason, a greater logic, because it is more vast, subtle, complex in its operations. It comprehends all the data which our observation fails to seize. It deduces from them results which neither our deduction nor induction can anticipate, because our conclusions and inferences have a meager foundation and are fallible and brittle. If we observe a happening, we judge and explain it from the result and from a glimpse of its most external constituents, circumstances, or causes. But each happening is the outcome of a complex nexus of forces which we do not and cannot observe, because all forces are to us invisible, but they are not invisible to the spiritual vision of the infinite. Some of them are actualities working to produce or occasion a new actuality. Some are possibles that are near to the pre-existent actuals and in a way included in the aggregate, but they can intervene. Always new possibilities that suddenly become dynamic potentials and add themselves to the nexus. And behind all are imperatives or an imperative, whose these possibilities are laboring to actualize. Moreover, out of the same nexus of forces, different results are possible. What will come out of them is determined by a sanction which was no doubt waiting and ready all the time, but seems to come in rapidly to intervene and alter everything. A decisive divine imperative. All this our reason cannot grasp, because it is the instrument of an ignorance with a very limited vision and a very small stock of accumulated or not always very certain or reliable knowledge. And because too, it has no means of direct awareness. For this is the difference between intuition and intellect. That intuition is born of a direct awareness, which intellect is an indirect action of a knowledge which constructs itself with difficulty out of the unknown from signs and indications and gathered data. But what is not evident to our reason and senses is self-evident to the infinite consciousness. And if there is this will of the infinite, it must be a will that acts in this full knowledge. And this is the perfect spontaneous result of a total self-evidence. It is neither a hampered evolutionary force bound by what it has evolved, nor an imaginary will acting in the void upon a free caprice. It is the truth of the infinite affirming itself in the determination of the infinite. It is evident that such a consciousness and will need not act in harmony with the conclusions of our limited reason or according to the procedure familiar to it and approved by our constructed notions, or in the subjection to an ethical reason, or working for a limited and fragmentary good. It might and does not admit things deemed by our reason irrational and unethical, because that was necessary for the final and total good and for the working out of the cosmic purpose. What seems to us irrational or reprehensible in relation to a partial set of facts, motives, desiderata, might be perfectly rational and approvable in relation to a much vaster motive and totality of a data and desiderata. Reason with its partial vision sets up constructed conclusions, which it strives to turn into general rules of knowledge and action. It compels into its rule by some mental device or get rid of what does not suit with it. An infinite consciousness would have no such rules. It would have instead large intrinsic truths governing automatically conclusions and results, but adapting them differently and spontaneously to a different total of circumstances, so that by this pliability and free adaptation it might seem to the narrower faculty to have no standards whatever. In the same way, we cannot judge of the principle and dynamic operation of the infinite going by the standards of the finite existence. What might be impossible for the one would be normal and self-evidently natural states and motives for the greater freer reality. It is this that makes the difference between our fragmentary mind consciousness constructing integrals out of its fractions and an essential and total consciousness, vision, and knowledge. It is not indeed possible so long as we are compelled to use reason as our main support. For it to abdicate altogether in favor of an undeveloped or half organized intuition. But it is imperative on us in a consideration of the infinite and its being and action to enforce on our reason and utmost plasticity and open it to an awareness of the larger states and possibilities of that which we are striving to consider. It will not do to apply our limited and limiting conclusion to that which is illimitable. If we concentrate only on one aspect and treat it as a whole, we illustrated the story of the blind man and the elephant. Each of the blind inquirers touched a different part and concluded that the whole animal was some object resembling the part of which he had had the touch. An experience of some one aspect of the infinite is valid in itself, but we cannot generalize from it that the infinite is that alone. Nor would it be safe to view the rest of the infinite in the terms of that aspect and exclude all the other viewpoints of spiritual experience. The infinite is at once an essentiality, a boundless totality and a multitude. All these have to be known in order to know truly the infinite. To see the parts alone and totality not at all or only a sum of the parts is a knowledge, but also at the same time an ignorance. To see the totality alone and ignore the parts is also a knowledge, and at the same time an ignorance. For a part may be greater than the whole because it belongs to the transcendence. To see the essence alone because it takes us back straight towards the transcendence, and negate the totality and parts is a penultimate knowledge. But here too there is a capital ignorance. A whole knowledge must be there, and the reason must become plastic enough to look at all sides, all aspects, and seek through them for that in which they are one. Thus too, if you see only the aspect of self, we may concentrate on its static silence and miss the dynamic truth of the infinite. If you see only the Ishvara, we may seize the dynamic truth but miss the eternal status and the infinite silence. Become aware of only a dynamic being, dynamic consciousness, dynamic delight of being, but miss the pure existence, pure consciousness, pure bliss of being. If we concentrate on Purusha Prakriti alone, we may see only the dichotomy of soul and nature, spirit and matter, and miss their unity. In considering the action of the infinite, we have to avoid the error of the disciple who thought of himself as the Brahman, refused to obey the warning of the elephant driver to budge from the narrow path, and was taken up by the elephant's track and removed out of the way. You are no doubt the Brahman, said the master to his bewildered disciple. But why did you not obey the driver Brahman and get out of the path of the elephant Brahman? We must not commit the mistake of emphasizing one side of the truth and concluding from it or acting upon it to the exclusion of all the other sides and aspects of the infinite. The realization, I am, that is true, but we cannot safely proceed on it unless we realize that all is that our self-existence is a fact, but we must also be aware of other selves, of the same self in other beings, and of that which exists both our own self and other self. The infinite is one in a multiplicity, and its action is only seizable by a supreme reason, which regards all and acts as the one awareness that observes itself in difference and respects of its own differences, so that each thing and each being has its form of essential being and its form of dynamic nature. Swarupa Swadharma, and all are respected in the total working. The knowledge and action of the infinite is one in an unbound variability. It would be, from the point of view of the infinite, truth equally and error to insist either on the sameness of the action in all circumstances or on a diversity of action without any unifying truth and harmony behind the diversity. In our own principle of conduct, if we sought to act in this greater truth, it would be equally an error to insist on our self alone, to insist on other selves alone. It is the self of all which we have to found a unity of action and a total, infinitely plastic yet harmonious diversity of action. For that is the nature of the working of the infinite. If you look from the viewpoint of a larger, more plastic reason, taking account of the logic of the infinite and the difficulties which meet our intelligence, which when it tries to conceive the absolute and omnipresent reality, we shall see that the whole difficulty is verbal and conceptual and not real. Our intelligence looks at this concept and absolute and sees that it must be indeterminable, and at the same time it sees a world of determinations which emanates from the absolute and exists in it. For it can emanate from nowhere else and can exist nowhere else. It is further baffled by the affirmation, also hardly disputable on the premises, that all this determinates or nothing else than this very indeterminable absolute. But the contradiction disappears when we understand that the indeterminability is not in its true sense negative, not an imposition of incapacity on the infinite, but positive, a freedom within itself from limitation by its own determinations, and necessarily a freedom from all external determination by anything not itself. Since there is no real possibility of such a not self coming into existence, the infinite is illimitably free, free to determine itself infinitely, free from all restraining effect of its own creations. In fact, the infinite does not create, it manifests what is in itself, in its own essence of reality. It is itself that essence of all reality, and all realities are powers of that one reality. The absolute neither creates nor is created in the current sense of making or being made. Or we can speak of creation only in the sense of the being becoming in form and movement, what is already in its substance and status. Yet we have to emphasize its indeterminability in that special and positive sense, not as a negation but as an indispensable condition of its free infinite self-determination, because without that reality would be a fixed eternal determinate, or else an indeterminate, fixed and bound to a sum of possibilities of determination inherent within it. Its freedom from all limitations, from any binding by its own creation, cannot be itself turned into a limitation, an absolute incapacity, a denial of all freedom of self-determination. It is this that would be a contradiction. It would be an attempt to diffuse and limit by negation the infinite and illimitable into the central fact of the two sides of nature, of the absolute, the essential and the self-creative or dynamic or real contradiction enters. It is only a pure infinite essence that can formulate itself in infinite ways. One statement is complementary to the other. There is no mutual cancellation, no incompatibility. It is only the dual statement of a single inescapable fact by human reason in human language. The same conciliation occurs everywhere. One look with a straight and accurate look on the truth of the reality. In our experience of it, we become aware of an infinite essentially free from all limitation by qualities, properties, futures. On the other hand, we are aware of an infinite teeming with innumerable qualities, properties, futures. Here again, the statement of illimitable freedom is positive, not negative. It does not negate what we see, but on the contrary, provides the indispensable condition for it. It makes possible a free and infinite self-expression in quality and future. A quality is the character of a power of conscious being, or we may say that the consciousness of being expressing what is in it makes the power of it power it brings our recognizable by a native stamp on it, which we call quality or character. Courage as a quality is such a power of being. It is a certain character of my consciousness, expressing a formulated force of my being, bringing out or creating a definite kind of force of my nature in action. So to the power of a drug to cure is its property, a special force of being a native to the herb of or mineral from which it is produced. And this speciality is determined by the real idea, concealed in the involved consciousness which dwells in the plant or mineral. The idea brings out in it what was there at the root of its manifestation and has now come out of thus empowered as the force of its being. All qualities, properties, futures, or such powers of conscious being thus put forth from itself by the Absolute. It has everything within it. It has the free power to put all forth. Yet we cannot define the Absolute as a quality of courage or a power of healing. We cannot even say that these are a characteristic feature of the Absolute, nor can we make up a sum of qualities and say that is the Absolute. But neither can we speak of the Absolute as a pure blank incapable of manifesting these things. On the contrary, all capacity is there. The powers of all qualities and characters are there inherently within it. The mind is in a difficulty because it has to say the Absolute is infinite is none of these things. These things are not the Absolute or infinite, and at the same time it has to say the Absolute is all these things. They are not something else than that. For that is the sole existence and all existence. Here it is evident that it is an infiniteness of thought, conception, and verbal expression which creates a difficulty, but there is no in reality none. For it would be evidently absurd to say that the Absolute is courage or curing power, or to say that courage and curing power are the Absolute. But it would be equally absurd to deny the capacity of the Absolute to put forth courage or curing power as self-expression in its manifestation. When the logic of the finite fails us, we have to see with a direct and unbound vision what is behind in the logic of the infinite. We can then realize that the infinite is infinite in quality, future, power, but that no sum of qualities, futures, powers can describe the infinite. We see that the Absolute, the Self, the Divine, the Spirit, the Being is one, the Transcendental is one, the Cosmos is one. But we see also that beings are many and each has a self, a spirit, yet different nature. And since the spirit and essence of things is one, we are obliged to admit that all this many must be that one, and it follows that one is or has become many. But how can the limited or relative be the Absolute, and how can man or beast or bird be the divine being? But in erecting this apparent contradiction, the mind makes a double error. It is thinking in terms of the mathematical finite unit which is sole in limitation, the one which is less than 2 and can become 2 only by division and fragmentation, or by addition and multiplication. But this is an infinite oneness. It is the essential and infinite oneness which can contain the 100 and the 1,000 and the million and billion and trillion. Whatever astronomical or more than astronomical figures you heap and multiply, they cannot overpass or exceed that oneness. For in the language of the Upanishad, it moves not, yet is always far in front when you would pursue and seize. It can be said of it that it would not be the infinite oneness if it were not capable of an infinite multiplicity, but that does not mean that the one is plural or can be limited or described as the sum of the many. On the contrary, it can be the infinite many because it exceeds all limitations or description by multiplicity and exceeds all the same. At the same time, all limitation by the finite conceptual calmness. Pluralism is an error because though there is the spiritual plurality, the many souls are dependent on the interdependent existences. That sum also is not the one nor is the cosmic totality. They depend on the one and exist in the by its oneness. Yet the plurality is not unreal. It is the one soul that dwells as the individual in these many souls, and they are eternal in the one and by the one eternal. This is difficult for the mental reason, which makes an opposition between the infinite and the finite, and associates finiteness and plurality and infinity with oneness. But in the logic of the infinite, there is no such opposition, and the eternity of the many in the one is a thing that is perfectly natural and possible. Again, we see that there is a infinite pure status and immobile silence of the spirit. We see too that there is a boundless movement of the spirit, a power, a dynamic spiritual all-containing self-extension of the infinite. Our conception forged upon this perception, it in itself valid and accurate, an opposition between the silence and status and the dynamic and movement. But to the reason and the logic of the infinite, there can be no such opposition. It's solely silent and static infinite, an infinite without an infinite power and dynamism, and energy is inadmissible except as a perception of an aspect, a powerless absolute. An impotent spirit is unthinkable, and infinite energy must be the dynamic of the infinite, and all power must be the potency of the absolute, and illimitable force must be the force of the spirit. But the silence, the status, or the base of the movement, and eternal immobility is the necessary condition, a field, essence, even of the infinite mobility. A stable being is the condition and foundation of the vast action of the force of being. It is when we arrive something of this silence, stability, immobility, that we can base on it a force and energy which in our superficial restless state would be inconceivable. Few. The opposition we make is mental and conceptual. In reality, the silence of the spirit and the dynamism of the spirit are complementary truths and inseparable. The immutable silent spirit may hold his infinite energy silent and immobile within it, for it is not bound by its own forces, is not that subject or instrument, but it does possess them, does release them, is capable of an eternal infinite action, does not vary or need to stop, and yet all the time is silent immobility inherent in his action and movement is not for a moment shaken or disturbed or altered by its action and movement. The witness silence of the spirit is there in the very grain of all the voices and workings of the nature. These things may be difficult for us to understand because our own surface finite capacity in either direction is limited on our conception or based on our limitations. But it should be easy to see that these relatives and finite conceptions do not apply to the absolute and infinite. Our conception of the infinite is formlessness, but everywhere we see form and form surrounding us, and it can be and is affirmed by the divine being, and he is at once form and the formless. And here too, the apparent contradiction does not correspond to a real opposition. The formless is not a negation of the power of formation, but the condition for the infinite free formation. For otherwise, there would be a single form or only a fixity or sum of possible forms in a finite universe. The formlessness is the character of the spiritual essence, the spiritual substance of the reality. All finite realities or powers, forms, self-shapings of that substance. The divine is formless and nameless, but by that very reason capable of manifesting all possible names and shapes of being, or forms or manifestations, not arbitrary inventions out of nothing. For line and color, moss and design, which are the essentials of form, carry them always in them a significance, or it might be said, secret values and significance of an unseen reality made visible. It is for that reason that figure, a line, hue, mass, composition can embody what would be otherwise unseen, can convey what would be otherwise occur to the sense. Form may be said to be the innate body, the inevitable self-revelation of the formless. And this is true not only of external shapes, but of the unseen formations of mind and life, which we seize only by our thought, and those sensible forms of which only the subtle grasp of the inner consciousness can become aware. Name in its deeper sense is not the word by which we describe the object, but the total power, quality, character of the reality which a form of things embodies, and which we try to sum up by a designated sound, a knowable name. Nomen in the sense we might say is Numen, the secret names of the gods of their power. quality, character of being caught up by the consciousness and made conceivable. The infinite is nameless, but in that namelessness, all possible names, nuance of the gods, and the names and forms of all realities are already envisaged and prefigured because they are there latent and inherent in all existence. It becomes clear from these considerations that the coexistence of the infinite and the finite, which is the very nature of the universal being, is not a juxtaposition or mutual inclusion of the two opposites, but as natural and inevitable as the relation of the principle of light and fire with the suns. The finite is a frontal aspect of and a self-determination of the infinite. No finite can exist in itself and by itself. It exists by the infinite and because it is of one essence and with the infinite. For by the infinite we do not mean solely an illimitable self-extension in space and time, but something that is also spaceless and timeless, a self-existent, indefinable and illimitable which can express itself in the infinitesimal as well as in the vast, in a second of time, in a point of space, in a passing circumstance. The finite is looked upon as a division of the indivisible, but there is no such thing, for this division is only apparent. There is a demarcation, but no real separation is possible. When we see the with the inner vision and the sense, or not with the physical eye, a tree or other object, what we become aware of is as infinite object. What we become aware of is an infinite one, reality constituting the tree or object. Pervading it is every atom and molecule, forming them out of itself, building the whole nature, process of the becoming, operation of the indwelling energy. All of these are itself, or this infinite, this reality. We see it extending indivisibly and uniting all objects so that none is really separate from it or quite separate from other objects. It stands, says the Gita, undivided in beings and yet as if divided. Thus, each object is that infinite and one is essential being with all other objects that are also forms and names, powers, nuance of the infinite. This incoercible unity in all divisions and diversities is the mathematics of the infinite, indicated in a verse of the Upanishads. This is the complete and that is the complete. Subtract the complete from the complete is the remainder. For so too it may be said of the infinite self-multiplication of the reality that all things are that self-multiplication. The one becomes many, but all the many are that which was already and is always itself, and in becoming of the becoming the many remains the one. There is no division of the one by the appearance of the finite, for it is the one infinite that appears to us as the many finite. The creation adds nothing to the infinite. It remains after creation what it was before. The infinite is not a sum of things, it is that which is all things and more. If this logic of the infinite contradicts the conception of our finite reason, it is because it exceeds it and does not base itself on the data of the infinite limited phenomena, but embraces the reality and sees the truth of all phenomena in the truth of the reality. It does not see them as separate beings, movements, names, forms, things, for that they cannot be, since they could be that only if they were phenomena in the void, and things without a common basis or essence, fundamentally unconnected, connected only by coexistence and pragmatic relation, not realities which exist by the root of unity and, so far as they can be considered independent or secured in the independence of outer or inner figure, and movement only by their perpetual dependence on their parent infinite. Their secret identity with the one identical. The identical is the root, their cause of forms, the one power of their varying powers, their constituting substance. The identical to our notion is the immutable. It is ever the same though through eternity, for if it is or becomes a subject to mutation, or if it admits of difference, it ceases to be identical. But what we see everywhere is an infinitely variable fundamental oneness, which seems the very principle of nature. The basic force of is one, but it manifests from itself innumerable forces. The basic substance is one, but it develops many different substances and millions of unlike objects. Mind is one, but differentiates itself into many mental states, mind formations, thoughts, perceptions differing from each other and entering into harmony or into conflict. A life is one, but the forms of life are unlike and innumerable. Humanity is one in nature, but there are different race types, and every individual man is himself and in some way unlike others. Nature insists on tracing lines of difference on the leaves of one tree. She drives differentiation so far as it has been found that lines on one man's thumb are different from the lines of every other man's thumb, so that they can be identified by the differentiation alone. Yet fundamentally all men are alike, and there is no essential difference or oneness or sameness is everywhere. Differentiation is everywhere. The indwelling reality has built the universe on the principles of the development of one one seed into a million different fashions. But this again is the logic of the infinite, or because the essence of the reality is immutably the same. It can assume securely these innumerable differences of atom and character and movement. For even if they were multiplied a trillionfold, that would not affect the underlying immutability of the eternal identical, because the self and spirit in things and beings is one everywhere. Therefore, nature can afford this luxury of infinite differentiation. If there were not this a secure basis which brings it about, the nothing changes, yet all changes. All the workings and creations would be in this play collapse into disintegration and chaos. And there would be nothing to hold her disparate movements and creations together. The immutability of the identical does not consist in a monotone of changeless sameness incapable of variation. It consists in unchangeableness of being, which is capable of endless formation of being, but which no differentiation can destroy or impair or minimize. The self becomes insect and bird and beast and man, but it is always the same self through these mutations, because it is the one who manifests himself infinitely in endless diversity. Our surface reason is prone to conclude that the diversity may be unreal, an appearance only. But if we look at a little deeper, we shall see that the real diversity brings out the real unity, shows it as it were in its utmost capacity, reveals all that it can, and is in itself delivers from its whiteness of hue the many tones of color, and or that are fused together there. Oneness finds itself infinitely in what seems to us to be of falling away from its oneness, but is really an inexhaustible, diverse display of unity. This is the miracle, the Maya of the universe, yet perfectly logical, natural, and matter of course to the self vision and self experience of the infinite. For the Maya of Brahman is at once the magic and the logic of an infinitely variable oneness. If, indeed, there were only a rigid monotone and of limited oneness and sameness, there would be no place for reason and logic. For logic consists in the right perception of relations. The highest work of reason is to find the one substance, the one law, the cementing latent reality connecting and unifying the many, the different, the discordant, and disparate. All universal existence moves between these two terms, the diversification of the one, unification of the many and diverse, and that must be because the one and the many are fundamental as aspects of the infinite. For what the divine self-knowledge and all knowledge brings out is its manifestation, must be a truth of its being, and the play of that truth is its lila. This, then, is the logic of the way of the universal being of Brahman, and the basic working of the reason, the infinite intelligence of Maya. As with the being of Brahman, so with its consciousness. Maya, it is not bound to a finite restriction of itself or to one stat or law of its action. It can be many things simultaneously, have many coordinated movements, which to the finite reason may seem contradictory. It is one but innumerably manifold, infinitely plastic, inexhaustibly adaptable. Maya is the supreme and universal consciousness and forces of the eternal and infinite, and being by its very nature unbound and illimitable. It can put forth many states of consciousness at a time, many disposition of its force without ceasing to be the same consciousness force forever. It is at once transcendental, universal, and individual. It is a supreme supracosmic being that is aware of itself as all being, as the cosmic self, as the consciousness force of cosmic nature, and at the same time experiences itself as the individual being and consciousness in all existence. The individual consciousness can see itself as limited and separate, but can also put off its limitations and know itself as universal and again as transcendent of the universe. This is because there is in all these states or positions or underlying them the same triune consciousness in a triple status. There is then no difficulty in the one than thus seeing or experiencing itself triply, whether from above in the transcendent existence, or from between in the cosmos self, or from below in the individual conscious being. All that is necessary for this to be accepted as natural and logical is to admit that there can be different real statuses of consciousness of the one being, and that cannot be impossible for an existence which is free and infinite and cannot be tied to a single condition. A free power of self-variation must be natural to a consciousness that is infinite. If the possibility of a manifold status of consciousness is admitted, no limit can be put to the ways of its variation of status, provided the one is aware of itself simultaneously in all of them. For the one and the infinite must be thus universally conscious. The one difficulty which a further consideration may solve is to understand the connections between a status of limited or constructed consciousness like ours, a status of ignorance, and the infinite self-knowledge and all knowledge. A second possibility of the infinite consciousness that must be admitted as its power of self-limitation or secondary self-formation into a subordinate movement. within the integral, illimitable consciousness and knowledge. For that is a necessary consequence of the power of self determination of the infinite. Each self determination of the self being must have its own awareness of its self truth and its self nature. Or, if we prefer, so to put it, the being is in that discriminate determination must be so self aware. Spiritual individuality means that each individual self or spirit is the center of self vision and all vision. The circumference, the boundless circumference, as we may say, of this vision may be the same for all, but the center may be different, not located as in a spatial point in a spatial circle, but a psychological center related with others through a coexistence of the diversely conscious many in the universal being. Each being in a world will see the same world, but see it from its own self being according to its own way of self nature. For each will manifest its own truth of the infinite, its own way of self determination and of meeting the cosmic determinations. Its vision by the law of unity in variety will no doubt be fundamentally the same as that of others, but it will still develop its own differentiation. As we see all human beings conscious in the one human way of the same cosmic things, yet always with an individual difference. This self-limitation would be not fundamental, but an individual speculation of a common universality or totality. The spiritual individual would act from his own center of the one truth and according to his self-nature, but on a common basis and not with any blindness to other self and other nature. It would be consciousness limiting in action with full knowledge, not a moment of ignorance. But apart from this individualizing self-limitation, there must also be the consciousness of the infinite, a power of cosmic limitation. It must be able to limit its action as so as to base a given world or universe and to keep in its own order, harmony, self-building. For the creation of a universe necessitates a special determination of the infinite consciousness to preside over the world and a holding back of all that is not needed for that moment. In the same way, the putting forth of an independent action of some power like mind, life, or matter must have as its support a similar principle of self-limitation. It cannot be said that such a movement must be impossible for the infinite because it is illimitable. On the contrary, this must be one of its many powers, for its powers or two are illimitable. But this also, like other self-determination of the infinite buildings, would not be a separation or a real division, for all the infinite consciousness would be around and behind it and supporting it, and the special movement itself would be intrinsically aware not only of itself but in essence of all that was behind it. This would be so inevitably in the integral consciousness of the infinite. But we can suppose also that an intrinsic, though not an active awareness of this kind, demarcating itself, yet indivisible, might be there too in the total self consciousness of the moment of the finite. This much cosmic or individual conscious self limitation would evidently be possible to the infinite and can be accepted by a larger reason as one of its spiritual possibilities. But so far, on this basis, any division or ignorance, separation, or binding and blinding limitation, such as is apparent in our own consciousness, would be unaccountable. Phew. But the third power or possibility of the infinite consciousness can be admitted, its power of self-absorption or plunging into itself into a state in which self-awareness exists, but not as knowledge and not as all knowledge, and the all would then be involved in pure self-awareness and knowledge, and the inner consciousness itself would be lost in pure being. This is luminously the state which we call the superconscious in an absolute sense, although most of what we call superconscious is in reality not that, but only a higher conscience, something that is conscious to itself and only superconscious to our own limited level of awareness. This self-absorption, this stance of infinity is again no longer luminously but darkly the state which we call the inconscient. For the being of the infinite is there, though by its appearance of inconscious it seems to us rather to be an infinite non-being, a self-oblivion intrinsic consciousness and force that or there in that apparent non-being. For by the energy of the inconscient or ordered world is created. It is created in a trance of self-absorption, the force acting automatically and with an apparent blindness as in a trance, but still with the inevitability and power of truth of the infinite. If you take a further step and and admit that a special or restricted and partial action of the self-absorption is possible to the infinite, an action not always of its infinitely concentrated and limitlessly in itself, but confined to a special status to us, status or to an individual or cosmic self-determination. We have then the explanation of the concentrated condition or status by which it becomes aware as separately of one aspect of its being. And that can then be a fundamental double status such as that of the nirguna standing back from the saguna and absorbed in his own purity and immobility, while the rest is held back behind a veil or not admitted within that special status. In the same way, we could account for the status of the consciousness aware of one field of being in or one moment of it, or while the awareness of all the rest would be held behind and veiled, or if it were cut off by a waking trance of dynamic concentration from the specialists or limited awareness occupied only within its own field or moment. The totality of the infinite consciousness would be there, not abolished, recoverable, but not evidently active only by implication, by inherence or by instrumentability of the limited awareness, not in its own manifest power and presence. It will be evident that all these three powers can be accepted as possible to the dynamics of the infinite consciousness, and it is by considering the many ways in which they can work that we may get a clue of the operations of Maya. This throws light incidentally on the opposition made by our minds between pure consciousness, pure existence, pure bliss, and that abundant activity. The manifold application, the endless vicissitudes of being, consciousness, and delight of being that take place in the universe. In the state of pure consciousness and pure being, we are aware of that only, a simple, immutable self-existent without form or object, and we feel that to be alone true and we feel that to be alone true and real. In other or dynamic state, we feel its dynamism to be perfectly true and natural, and we are and are even capable of thinking that no such experience as that of pure consciousness is possible. Yet it is now evident that to the infinite consciousness both the static and the dynamic are possible. There are two of its statuses, and both can be present simultaneously in the universal awareness. The one witnessing the other and supporting it, or not looking at it and yet automatically supporting it. Or the silence and status may be there penetrating the activity or throwing it up like an ocean immobile below throwing up a mobility of waves on its surface. This is also a reason why it is possible for us to in certain conditions of a being to be aware of several different statuses of consciousness at the same time. That is a state of being experienced in yoga in which we become a double consciousness, of one on the surface, small, active, ignorant, swayed by thoughts and feelings, grief and joy, and all kinds of surface being with an immovable detachment, all kinds of reactions. The other within calm, vast, equal, observing the surface being with an immovable detachment or intelligence, or it may be acting upon its agitation to quite enlarge, transform it. So too we can rise to a consciousness above and observe the various parts of a being, inner and outer, mental, vital and physical, and the subconscious below all, and act upon one or other or the whole from that higher status. It is possible also to go down from that height or from any height into any of this lower status and take its limited light or its obscurity as a place of working, while the rest that we are is either temporarily put away or put behind, or else kept as a field of reference from which we can get support, a sanction or light and influence, or as a status into which we can ascend or recede and from it observe the inferior moments, or we can plunge into trance, get within ourselves and be conscious there while all outward things are excluded, or we can go beyond even this inner awareness and lose ourselves in some deeper other consciousness or some higher superconscious. There is also a pervading equal consciousness into which we can enter and see all ourselves, and one enveloping glance or omnipresent awareness, one and indivisible. All this which looks strange and abnormal or may seem fantastic to the surface reason acquainted only with our normal status of limited ignorance, and its movements divided from our inner higher and total reality becomes easily intelligible and admissible in the light of the larger reason and the logic of the infinite, or by the admission of the greater illimitable power of the self, the spirit in us which is of one essence with the infinite. Brahman, the reality, is the self-existent absolute, and Maya is the consciousness and force of this self-existent. But with regard to the universe, Brahman appears as the self of all existence, Atman, the cosmic self, but also as the supreme self transcendent of its own cosmicity, and at the same time individual, universal in each way. Maya can then be seen as the self-power, Atma Shakti, or of the Atman. It is true that when we first become aware of this aspect, it is usually in a silence of the whole being, or at least in a silence within which draws back or stands away from the surface action. This self is then felt as a status in the silence, an immobile, immutable being, self existence, pervading the whole universe, omnipresent in all, but not dynamic or active, aloof from the ever mobile energy of Maya. In the same way, we can become aware of it as a Purusha, separate from Prakriti, the conscious being standing back from the activities of nature. But this is an exclusive concentration which limits itself to a spiritual status and puts away from all its activity in order to realize the freedom of Brahman, the self existent reality from all limitation by its own action and manifestation. It is an essential realization, but not the total realization. For we can see the conscious power, the Shakti that acts and creates is not other than the Maya or all knowledge Brahman. It is the power of the self. Prakriti is the working of the Purusha, conscious being active by its own nature. The duality then of the soul and the world energy, silent self and creative power of the spirit is not really something dual and separate. It is biune. Yeah, as we cannot separate free fire and power of fire, it has been said, so we cannot separate the divine reality and this consciousness force, Chit Shakti. This first realization of self as something intensely silent and purely static is not the whole truth of it. And there can also be a realization of the self in its power, self as the condition of the world activity and world coexistence. However, the self is the fundamental aspect of Brahman, but with a certain stress on its impersonality, and therefore the power of the self has the appearances of a force that acts automatically with the self sustaining it, witness and support and originator and enjoyer of his activities, but not involved in them for a moment. As soon as we become aware of the self, we are conscious of it as eternal, unborn, unembodied, uninvolved in its workings. It can be felt within the form of being, but also as enveloping it, as above it, surveying its embodiment from above. Adhyaka, Adhyak, Adhyaka, Adhyaksha. It is omnipresent, the same in everything, infinite and pure and intangible forever. This self can be experienced as the self of the individual, the self of the thinker, doer, enjoyer, and even so as is always has this greater character, its indivisibility, individuality. It is its individuality as at the same time a vast universality, or very readily passes into that, and the next step to that is a sheer transcendence or a complex, complete, and ineffable passing into the absolute. The self is that aspect of the Brahman in which it is and infinitely felt as at once individual, cosmos, transcendent of the universe. The realization of the self is the straight and swift way towards individual liberation, a static universality, a natural transcendence. At the same time, there is a realization of self in which it is felt not only sustaining and pervading and enveloping all things, but constituting everything and identified in a free identity with all its becomings in nature. Even so, freedom and impersonality are always the character of the self. There is no appearance of subjection to the workings of its own power in the universe, such as the apparent subjection of the Purusha to Prakriti. To realize the self is to realize the eternal freedom of the spirit. Few. The conscious being, Purusha, is the self as originator, witness, support, and lord and enjoyer of the forms and works of nature. As aspect of self is in its essential character transcendental even when involved and identified with its universal and individual becomings. So the Purusha aspect is characteristically universal, individual, and intimately connected with nature, even when separated from her. For this conscious spirit, while retaining its personality and eternity's universality, puts on at the same time a more personal aspect. It is the impersonal personal being in nature from whom it is not altogether detached, for it is always occupied, for it is always coupled with her. Nature acts for the Purusha and by its sanction, for its will and pleasure. The conscious being imparts its consciousness to the energy we call nature. The resumes in that consciousness the workings as in a mirror, accepts the forms which she, the executive cosmic force, creates and imposes on it. A gives or withdraws its sanction from her movements. The experience of Purusha Prakriti, the spirit or conscious being, in its relation to nature, is of immense pragmatic importance. For on these relations, the whole play of the consciousness depends in the embodied being. If the Purusha in us is passive and always nature to act, accepting what she imposes on him, giving a constant automatic sanction, then the soul in mind, life, body, the mental, vital, physical being in us becomes subject to our nature, ruled by its formation, driven by its activities, and that is the normal state of our ignorance. If the Purusha in us becomes aware of itself as the witness and stands back from nature, and that is the first step to the soul's freedom, for it becomes detached, and it is possible that to know nature and her processes and in all independence, since we are no longer involved in our works, to accept or not to accept, to make the sanction no longer automatic but free and effective, or we can choose what she shall do, not do in us, or we can stand back altogether from our works and withdraw easily into the self spiritual silence, or we can reject our present formation and rise to a spiritual level of existence, and from there recreate our existence. The Purusha can cease to be subject, Anila, Anisa, and become lord of its nature, Ishvara. In the philosophy of the Sankhya's, we find developed most thoroughly the metaphysical idea of the Purusha Prakriti. These two are eternally separate entities, but in relation to each other. Prakriti is nature, power, and executive power. It is energy apart from consciousness, for consciousness belongs to the Purusha. Prakriti without Purusha is the inert, mechanical, inconscient. Prakriti develops as its formal self and basis of action, primal matter, and in it manifests the life and sense and mind and intelligence. But intelligence too, since it is part of nature and its product in primal matter, is also inert, mechanical, and inconscient. A conception which sheds a certain light on the order and perfectly related workings of the inconscient in the material universe. It is the light of the soul, the spirit, that is important to the mechanical workings of the sense, mind, and intelligence. They become conscious by its consciousness, even as they become active only by the ascent of the spirit. The Purusha becomes fire. The Purusha becomes free by drawing back from Prakriti. It becomes master of her by refusing to be involved in matter. Nature acts by three principles, or modes or qualities of its stuff and its action, which in us becomes the fundamental modes of our psychological and physical substance and its workings. The principle of inertia, the principle of kinesis, and the principle of balance, light and harmony. When these are in unequal motion, but action takes place when they fall into equilibrium. She passes into quiescence. Purusha, conscious being, is plural, not one and single, while nature is one. It would seem to follow that whatever principle of oneness we find in existence belongs to nature, but each soul is independent and unique, soul to itself and separate, whether in its enjoyment of nature or its liberation from nature. All these positions of the Sankhya's we find to be perfectly valid in experience when we come into in direct inner contact with the realities of individual soul and universal nature, but they are pragmatic proofs that we are not bound to accept them as the whole or the fundamental truth either of self or of nature. Prakriti presents itself as an inconscient energy in the material world, but as the scale of consciousness rises, she reveals herself more and more as a conscious force, and we preserve that. Even our inconscience concealed a secret consciousness. So do conscious being is many in its individual source, but in itself we can experience it as one in all and one in its own essential existence. Moreover, the experience of the soul and nature as dual is true, but the experience of their unity has also its validity. If nature or energy is able to impose its forms and workings on being, it can only be because of it is nature or energy of being, and so the being can accept them as its own. If the being can become lord of nature, it must be because it is its own nature, which it has passively watched through doing its work, but can control and master. Even in its passivity, its consent is necessary to the action of Prakriti, and this relation shows sufficiently that the two are not alien to each other. The duality is a position taken up. A double status accepted for the operation of the self manifestation of the being, but there is no eternal and fundamental separateness and dualism of being and its consciousness force of the soul and nature. Few. It is the reality, the self, that takes the position of the conscious being, regarding and accepting or ruling the works of its own nature. An apparent duality is created in order that there may be free action of the nature working itself out with the support of the spirit, and again in a free and masterful action of the spirit controlling and working out nature. This duality is also necessary that the spirit may be at any time at liberty to draw back from any formation of its nature and dissolve or formation or accept or enforce a new or higher formation. These are very evident possibilities of the spirit in its dealing with its own force, and they can be observed and verified in our own experience. They are logical results of the powers of the infinite consciousness, powers which we have seen to be native to its infinity. The Purusha aspect and the Prakriti aspect go always together, and whatever status Nature or consciousness force in action assumes, a manifest or develops, that there is a corresponding status of the spirit. In its supreme status, the spirit is the supreme conscious being. Purushottama, the consciousness force, is the supreme nature, para prakriti. In its status of the gradations of nature, the spirit takes a poise of its being proper to that gradation. In mind, nature is it becomes the mental being. In mind nature, it becomes the mental being. In life nature, it becomes the vital being. In nature of matter, it becomes the physical being. In supermind, it becomes the being of knowledge. In the supreme spiritual status, it becomes the being of bliss and pure existence. In us, in the embodied individual, it stands behind all this as the psychic entity, the inner self supporting the other formulations of our consciousness and spiritual existence. The Purusha individualized in us is cosmic in the cosmos, transcendent in the transcendence. The identity with the self is apparent, but it is the self in its pure personal status of the spirit in things and beings. Impersonal because undifferentiated by personal quality. Personal because it presides over the individualizations of the self in each individual, which deals with the works of its consciousness force, its executive force of self nature, in whatever pose is necessary for that purpose. But it is evident that whatever the posture taken or relation formed in any individual nodus of Purusha Prakriti, the being is in a fundamental cosmic relations lord or ruler of its nature. For even when it allows nature to have its own way with it, its consent is necessary to support its workings. And this cosmos cut in its fullest revelation in the third aspect of the reality, the divine being who is the master and creator of the universe. Here, the supreme person, the being, in its transcendental and cosmic consciousness and force, comes to the front, omnipotent, omniscient, the controller of all energies, the conscious in all that is conscient or inconscient, the inhabitant of all souls and minds and hearts and bodies. The ruler or the overruler of all works, the enjoyer of all delight, the creator who has built all things in his own being, the all person of whom all beings or personalities, the power from whom or all powers, the self, the spirit in all, by his being, the father of all that is, in his consciousness force, the divine mother, the friend of all creatures, the all blissful and all beautiful, of whom beauty and joy are the revelation, the all beloved and the all lover, in a certain sense, so seen and understood. This becomes the most comprehensive of the aspects of the reality, since here all are united in a single formulation. For the Ishvara is the supracosmic as well as the intracosmic. He is that which exceeds and inhabits and supports all individuality. He is the supreme and universal Brahman, the absolute, the supreme self, the supreme Purusha, but very clearly, this is not the personal god of popular religions, a being limited by his qualities, individual and separate from all others. For all such personal gods are only limited representations or names and divine personalities of the one Ishvara, and neither is this the Saguna Brahman, active and possessed of qualities, for that is the only one side of the being of the Ishvara. The Nirguna, immobile and without qualities, is another aspect of his existence. Ishvara is Brahman, the reality, self, spirit, revealed as possessor and enjoyer of his own self-existence, creator of the universe and one with it, pantheos and yet superior to it, the eternal, the infinite, the ineffable, the divine transcendent. The sharp oppositions made between personality and impersonality by our mental way of thinking is the creation of the mind, based on the appearances of the material world. For here, in terrestrial existence, that inconscient from which everything takes its origin appears as something as entirely impersonal. And nature, the inconscient energy, is entirely impersonal in her manifest essence and dealings. All forces wear the mask of impersonality. All qualities and powers, love and delight and consciousness itself have this aspect. Personality makes its apparition as a creation of consciousness in an impersonal world. It is a limitation by a restricted formation of powers, qualities, habitual forces of the natural action, and imprisonment in a limited circle of self-experience, which we have to transcend. To lose personality is necessary if we are to pass universality. Still more necessary if we are to rise into the transcendence. But what we thus call personality is only a formation of superficial consciousness. Behind it is the forces Behind it is the person who takes on various personalities, who can have at the same time many personalities, but is himself one, real, eternal. If you look at things from a larger point of view, we might say that what is impersonal is only a power of the person. Existence itself has no meaning without an existence. Consciousness has no standing place if there is no none who is conscious. Delight is useless and invalid without an enjoyer. A love can have no foundation or fulfillment if there is no lover. All power must be odious. Odious if there is not an almighty. For what we mean by person is conscious being. Even if this emerges here as a term or product of the inconscient, it is not that in reality, for it is the inconscient itself that is a term of the secret consciousness. What emerges is greater than that in which it emerges. As mind is greater than matter, soul than mind, spirit most secret of all, the supreme emergence, the last revelation is the greatest of all, and spirit is the Purusha, the all person, the omnipresent conscious being. It is the mind's ignorance of this true person in us, its confusion of person with our experience of ego and limited personality, the misleading phenomenon of the emergence of limited consciousness and personality in an inconscient existence that have made us create an opposition between these two aspects of the reality. But in truth, there is no opposition, and and eternal, infinite self-existence is the supreme reality. But the supreme transcendent eternal being, self and spirit, an infinite person, we must say, because this being is the essence and source of all personality, is the reality and meaning of self existence. So too, the cosmos, self, spirit, being, person is the reality and meaning of cosmic existence. The same self, spirit, being, or person manifesting its multiplicity is the reality and meaning of individual existence. If we admit the divine being, the supreme persons, and all persons as the Ishvars, a difficulty arises in understanding is this rule or government of world existence, because we immediately transfer to him our mental conception of a human ruler. We picture him as acting by the mind and mental will in an omnipotent, arbitrary fashion upon a world on which he imposes his mental conceptions as laws, and we conceive of his will as a free caprice of his personality. But there is no need for the divine being to act by an arbitrary will or idea as an omnipotent yet ignorant human being. If such an omnipotence were possible, might do, for he is not limited by mind. He has all consciousness in which he is aware of the truth of all things and aware of his own all wisdom, walking them out according to the truth that is in him, in them, their significance, their possibility or necessity, the imperative selfness of their nature. The divine is free and not bound by laws of any making, but still he acts by laws. But still he acts by laws and processes because they are the expression of the truth of things, are not their mechanical, mathematical, or other outward truth alone, but the spiritual reality of what they are and what they have become and have yet to become, what they have it within themselves to really realize. He is himself present in the working, but he also exceeds. He also exceeds and can overrule it. For on one side, nature works according to a limited complex of formulas, and it is informed and supported by the executions by the divine presence. But on the other side, there is an overseeing, a higher workings and determinations, even an intervention, free not by but not arbitrary, often appearing to us magical and miraculous because it proceeds and acts upon nature from a divine supernature. Nature here is a limited expression of that supernature and open to intervention or mutation by its light, its force, its influence. The mechanical, mathematical, automatic law of things is a fact, but within is there a spiritual law of consciousness at work, which gives to the mechanical steps of nature forces as inner turn and value, inner turn and value, a significant rightness and a secretly conscious necessity. And above it, there is a spiritual freedom, and that knows and acts in the supreme and universal truth of spirit. Our view of the divine government of the world or of the secret of its action is either incurably anthropomorphic or else incurably mechanical. But both the anthropomorphism and mechanism have their elements of truth, but they are only a side, an aspect, and the real truth is that the world is governed by the one in all and overall who is infinite in his consciousness, and it is according to the law and logic of an infinite consciousness that we have to understand the significance and building and movement of of the universe. If we regard this aspect of the one reality and put it in close connection with the other aspects, we can get a complete view of the relation between the eternal self-existence and the dynamics of the consciousness force by which it manifests the universe. If we plan ourselves to, if we place ourselves in a silent, self-existent, immobile, static, inactive, it will appear that a conceptive consciousness force Maya able to effectualize all its conceptions, a dynamic concert of the self of silence is doing everything. It takes its stand on the fixed, unmoving, eternal status and casts the spiritual substance of being into an all manner of forms and movements to which its passivity consents, or in which it or on which it takes impartial pleasure. Its immobile delight of creative and mobile existence. Whether this be a real or an illusory existence, there must be substance and significance. Consciousness is at play and with being, force of nature, or does with what it wills with existence and makes it the stuff of our creations. But secretly, the cosmos of the being must be there at every step to make this possible. And there is an evident truth in this perception of things. It is that we see happening everywhere in us and around us. It is a truth of the universe and must answer to a fundamental truth aspect of the absolute. But when we step back from the other dynamic appearances of things, not into a witness silence, but into an inner dynamic participating experience of the spirit, we find that this consciousness force or Maya Shakti is itself the power of the being, the self existent, the Ishvara, the being is Lord of that and all of all things. We see him doing everything in his own sovereignty as the creator and ruler of his own manifestation. Or if he stands back and allows freedom of action to the forces of nature and the creatures. His sovereignty is still innate in the permission. At every step is tacit sanction. Let it be so. Tatatsu is there implicit, for otherwise nothing could be done or happen. Being and its consciousness force, spirit and nature cannot be fundamentally dual. What nature does is really done by the spirit. This too is a truth of that becomes evident when we go behind and feel the presence of a living reality, which is everything and determines everything, is the all powerful and all ruler. This too is a fundamental truth aspect of the absolute. Again, if we remain absorbed in the silence, the creative consciousness and the works disappear into the silence. And nature and the creation for us cease to exist or be real. On the other hand, if we look exclusively at the being in its aspect of the soul existent Purusha and the unruler, the power of Shakti by which he does all things disappears into his uniqueness or becomes an attribute of his cosmic personality. The absolute monarchy of the one being becomes our perception of the universe. Both these experiences create many difficulties for the mind due to its non-perceptions of the reality of the self-power, of whether in coincidence or in its inaction, or to a too exclusively negative experience of the self, or to the too anthropomorphic character our conceptions attached to the Supreme Being as a ruler. It is evident that we are looking at an infinite of which self power is capable of many movements, all of them valid. If you look again more largely and take account of both the impersonal and the personal truths of things as one truth, if in that light, the light of personality is impersonality, we see the bion aspect of self and self power. And then in the person aspect, a dual person emerges, Ishvara Shakti, the divine self and the creator and the divine mother and creatrix of the universe. And that becomes apparent to us the mystery of the masculine and feminine cosmic principles whose play and interaction are necessary for all creation. In the superconscious truth of the self-existence, these two are fused and implied in each other, or one and indistinguishable. But in the spiritual pragmatic truth of the dynamism of the universe, they emerge and become active. The divine mother energy as the universal creatrix, Maya, Para Prakriti, Chit Shakti, manifest principle, manifest the cosmic self and Ishvara, and her own self power as a dual principle. It is through her and that the being, the self, the Ishvara acts, and he does nothing except by her, though his will is implicit in her. It is she who works out all as the supreme consciousness, force who holds all souls and beings within her and as an executive nature. All exist and acts according to nature. All is the consciousness force manifesting and playing with the being in millions of forms and movements into which like she casts his existence. If we draw back from her workings, then all can fall into quiescence and we can enter into the silence, or because she consents to cease from her dynamic activity. But it is in her quiescence and silence that we are quiescent and cease. If we would affirm our independence of nature, she reveals to us the supreme and omnipresent power of the Ishvara and ourselves as beings of his being. But that power is herself and we are that inner supernature. If we would realize a higher formation or status of being, then it is still through her, through the divine Shakti, the consciousness force of the spirit, that it has to be done. Our surrender must be to the divine being through the divine mother, for it is towards or into the supreme nature that our ascension has to take place, and it can only be done by the supramental Shakti taking up our mentality and transforming it into our super mentality. Thus we see that there is no constant contradiction or incompatibility between these three aspects of existence, or between them in the eternal status of and the three modes of its dynamics of walking in the universe, of one being, one reality, or as self basis, supports, informs as Purusha or conscious being experiences, as Ishvara wills, governs and possesses its world of manifestation, created and kept in motion and action by its own consciousness force or self power, Maya, Prakriti, Shakti. A certain difficulty arises for our mind in reconciling these different forces, phases, or fronts of the one self and spirit, because we are obliged to use abstract conceptions and defining words and ideas for something that is not abstract, something that is spiritually living and intensely real. Our abstractions get fixed into differentiating concepts and with sharp lines between them. But the reality is not of that nature. Its aspects are many but shade off into each other. Its truth could only be rendered by ideas and images, metaphysical and yet living and concrete, images which might be taken by the pure reason as figures and symbols, but are more than that and mean more to be more to the intuitive vision and feeling, for they are realities of a dynamic spiritual experience, the impersonal truth of things that the things can be rendered into the abstract formulas of the pure reason. But there is another side of truth which belongs to the spiritual or mystic vision, and without that inner vision of realities, the abstract formulation of them is insufficiently alive, incomplete. The mystery of things is the true truth of things. The intellectual presentation is only truth in representation, in abstract symbols, as if in a cubist, as if in a cubist order of thought speech in geometric figure. It is necessary in a philosophic inquiry to confine oneself mostly in this intellectual presentation. But it is as well to remember that this is only the abstraction of the truth, and to seize it completely or express it completely, there is needed a concrete experience and a more living and full-blooded language, full-bodied language. Here it becomes opportune to see how, in this aspect of the reality, we must regard the relations we have discovered between the one and the many. This amounts to a determination of the few. True connection between the individual and the divine being, between the soul and the Ishvara. In the normal theistic conception of the many are created by God, made by Him as potter might make a vessel. They are dependent on Him as our creatures, on their Creator. But in this larger view of the Ishvara, the many are themselves the divine one in their inmost reality, individual selves of the supreme and universal self-existent, eternal as He is eternal, but eternal in His being. Our material existence is indeed a creation of nature, but the soul is an immortal portion of the divinity, and behind it is the divine self in the natural creature. Still, the one is the fundamental truth of existence. The many exist by the one, and there is therefore an entire dependence of the manifested being on the Ishvara. The dependence is concealed by the separative ignorance of the ego, which strives to exist in its own right, although at every step it is evidently dependent on the cosmic power that created it, moved by it, a part of its cosmic being and action. This effort of the ego is clearly a misprision, an erroneous reflection of the truth of the self-existence that is within us. It is true that there is something in us not in the ego, nor but in the self and the inmost being that surpasses cosmic nature and belongs to the transcendence. But this too finds itself independent of nature only by dependence on a higher reality. It is through self-giving or surrender of soul and nature to the divine being that we can attain to our highest self and supreme reality. For it is the divine being who is that highest self and that supreme reality. And we are self existent and eternal only in his eternity and by self existence. The dependence is not contradictory of the identity, but is itself the doer, but itself the door to the realization of the identity. So that here again we meet that phenomenon of duality, expressing unity, proceeding from unity, and opening back into unity, which is the constant secret and fundamental operation of the universe. It is this truth of the consciousness of the infinite that creates the possibility of all relation between the many and the one, among which the realization of the oneness by the mind, the presence of oneness in the heart, the existence of the oneness in all the members is the highest peak, and yet it does not annul but confirms all the other personal relations and gives them their fullness, their complete delight, their entire significance. This too is the magic, but also the logic of the infinite. One problem still remains to be solved, and it can be solved on the same basis. It is the problem of the opposition between the non manifest and the manifestation. For it might be said that all that has been advanced hitherto may be true of the manifestation, but the manifestation is the reality of the inferior order, a partial movement derived from the non-manifest reality, and when we enter into that which is significantly real, these truths of the universe cease to have any validity. The non-manifest is the timeless, the utterly eternal, and irreducible absolute, self-existent, to which the manifestation and its limitations can give no clue, or only a clue that by its insufficiency or its illusory and deceptive. This raises no problem of the relation of time to the timeless spirit, for we have supposed on the contrary that what is in unmanifestation is in the timeless eternal is manifested in time eternity. If that is so, if the temporal is an expression of the eternal, then however different the conditions, however or partial the expression, yet what is fundamental in the time expression must be in some way pre-existent in the transcendence and drawn from the timeless reality. For if not, though these fundamentals must come into it direct from an absolute which is other than time or timelessness, and the timeless spirit must be a supreme spiritual negation, and indeterminable, having the absolute's freedom from limitation by what is formulated in time. It must be the negative to the time positive, in the same relation to it as the nirguna to the saguna. But in fact, what we mean by the timeless is the spiritual status of the existence not subject to the time movement or to the successive or relative time experience of the past, present, and future. The timeless spirit is not necessarily a blank. It may hold all in itself, but in essence without reference to time or form or relation or circumstance, perhaps in an eternal unity. Eternity is the common term between time and the timeless spirit. What is in the timeless unmanifested, implied, essential, appears in time, in movement, or at least in design and relation, in result and circumstance. These two then are the same eternity, or the same eternal in a double status. They are a twofold status of being and consciousness, one in eternity of the immobile status, the other in an eternity of the motion and status. The original status is that of the reality, timeless and spaceless. Space and time would be the same reality, self-extended to contain the deployment of what was within it. The difference would be as in all other oppositions, the spirit looking at itself in essence and principle of being, and the same spirit looking at itself in the dynamism of the essence and principle. Space and time are our names and this self-extension of the one reality. We are apt to see space as a static extension in which all things stand or move together as in a fixed order. We see time as a mobile extension which is measured by movement and event. Space then would be Brahman in self-extended status. Time would be the Brahman in self-extended movement. But this may be only a first view and inaccurate. Space may be really a constant mobile. The constancy and persistence and time relation of things in its creating the sense of stability of space. The mobility creating the sense of time movement in stable space. Or again, space would be Brahman extended for the holding together of forms and objects. Time would be Brahman's self-extended for the deployment of the movement of self-power carrying forms and objects. The two would then be a dual aspect of one and the same self-extension of the cosmic eternal. A purely physical space might be regarded as in itself a property of matter, but matter is a creation of energy in movement. Space, therefore, in the material world could be either a fundamental self-extension of material energy or its self-formed existence field. It's the representation of the inconscient infinity in which it is acting, a figure in which it accommodates the formulas and movements of its own action and self-creation. Time would be itself the course of that movement, or else an impression created by it, an improve impression of something that first prevents itself to us as regularly successive in its appearance, a division or a continuum upholding the continuity of movement and yet mocking of its successions, or because the movement itself is regularly successive, or else time could be a dimension of space necessary for the complete action of the energy, but not understood by us as such because it is seen by our conscious subjectivity as something itself subjective, felt by our mind, not pursued by our senses, and therefore not recognized as a dimension of space, and as to us the appearance of a sense created or sense pursued objective extension. In any case, if spirit is the fundamental reality, time and space must either be conceptual condition under which the spirit sees its own movement or energy, or else they must be fundamental conditions of the spirit itself which assume a different appearance or status according to the status of consciousness in which they manifest. In other words, there is a different time and space for each status of our consciousness, and even different movements of time and space within each status, but all would be renderings of a fundamental spiritual reality of time space. In fact, when we go behind physical space, we become aware of an extension on which all this movement is based, and this extension is spiritual and not material. It is self or spirit containing all actions of its own energy. This origin or basic reality of space begins to become apparent when we draw back from the physical, for then we become aware of a subjective space extension in which mind itself lives and moves, and which is other than the physical space, time. And yet there is an interpenetration, for our mind can move in its own space in such a way as to effectuate a movement also in space of matter, or act upon something distant in space of matter. In a still deeper conditions of consciousness, we are aware of a pure spiritual space. In this awareness, time may no longer seem to exist, or because all movement ceases, or if there is a movement of or happening, it can take place independent of any observable time sequence. If we go behind time by a similar inward motion, drawing back from the physical and seeing it without being involved in it, we discover that time observation and time movement are relative, but time itself is real and eternal. Time observation, time depends not only on the measures used, but on the consciousness and the position of the observer. Moreover, each state of consciousness has a different time relation. Time in mind consciousness and time mind space has not the same sense and measure of its movements as in physical space. It moves there quickly or slowly according to the state of consciousness. Each state of consciousness has its own time, and yet there can be relation of time between them. And when we go behind the physical surface, we find several different time statuses and time moments coexist in the same consciousness. This is evident in dream time where a long sequence of happenings can occur in a period which corresponds to a second or a few seconds of physical time. There is then a certain relation between different time statuses, but no ascertainable correspondence of measure. It would seem as if time had no objective reality, but depends on whatever conditions may be established by action of consciousness in its relation to status and motion of being. Time would seem to be purely subjective, but in fact, space also would appear to be in mutual relation to of mind space and matter space to be subjective. In other words, both are the original spiritual extension, but it is rendered by mind in its purity into a subjective mind field, and by sense mind into an objective field of sense perception. Subjectivity and objectivity are only two sides of one consciousness, and the cardinal fact is that any given time or space, or any given time space as a whole, is a status of being in which there is a movement of the consciousness and force of the being, a movement that creates or manifests events and happenings. It is the relation of the consciousness that sees and the force that formulates the happenings, a relation inherent in the status. What is this? I've had Very dull you. A relation inherent in the status, which determines the sense of time and creates our awareness of time movement, time relation, time measure. In its fundamental truth, the original status of time behind all its variation is nothing else than the eternity of the eternal. And just as the fundamental truth of space, the original sense of reality is the infinity of the infinite. The being can have three different status of its consciousness with regard to its own eternity. The first is that in which there is the immobile status of the self in its essential existence, self-absorbed or self-conscious. But in other case, without development of consciousness in movement or happening, that is what consciousness, that is what we distinguish as its timeless eternity. The second is its whole consciousness of the successive relations of all things belonging to a distinct or an actually proceeding manifestation in which what we call past, present, and future stand together as if in a map or settled design, or very much as an artist or painter or architect might hold all the detail of his work viewed as a whole, intended or reviewed in his mind or arranged in a plan or for execution. This is the stable status or simultaneous integrality of time. This seeing of time is not at all part of our normal awareness of events as they happen, though our view of the past, because it is already known and can be regarded as the whole, may put on something on this character. But we know that this consciousness exists because it is possible in an exceptional state to enter into it and see things from the viewpoint of this simultaneity of time vision. The third side is that of a processive movement of consciousness first and a successive working out of what has been seen by it in the static vision of the eternal. This is the time moment, but it is one and the same eternity, and this triple status exists and the movement takes place. There are not really two eternities, one an eternity of status, another of eternity of movement, but there are different statuses or positions taken by consciousness with regard to the one eternity. For it can see the whole time development from outside or from above the movement. It can take a stable position within the movement and see the few. It can take a stable position within the movement and see the before and after in a fixed, determined, or distant succession, or it can instead a mobile position in the moment itself, move with it from moment to moment, and see all that has happened receding back into the past and all that has to happen coming towards it from the future. Or else it may concentrate on the moment it occupies and see nothing but what is in that moment and immediately around or behind it. All these positions can be taken by the being of the infinite in a simultaneous vision or experience. It can see time from above and inside time, exceeding it or not within it. It can see the timeless develop the time moment without ceasing to be timeless. It can embrace the whole moment in a static and dynamic vision and put out at the same time something of itself into the moment vision. This simultaneity must seem to the finite consciousness tied to the moment vision, a magic of the infinite, a magic of Maya, to its own way, a perpetual perception which needs to limit to envisage one status only at a time in order to harmonize. It would give a sense of confused and inconsistent unreality. But to an infinite consciousness, such a integral simultaneity of vision and experience would be perfectly logical and consistent. All could be elements of a whole vision, capable of being closely related together in a harmonious arrangement, a multiplicity of view bringing out the unity of the thing seen, a diverse presentation of concomitant aspects of the one reality. If there can be the simultaneous multiplicity of self-presentation of one reality, we see that there is no impossibility in the coexistence of a timeless eternal and a time eternity. It would be the same eternity viewed by a dual self-awareness, and there could be no opposition between them. It would be a correlation of two powers of the self-awareness of the infinite and eternal reality, a power of status and non-manifestation, a power of self-affecting action and movement and manifestation. That simultaneity, however contradictory and difficult to reconcile it might seem to our finite surface seeing, would be intrinsic and normal to the Maya or eternal self-knowledge and all knowledge of Brahman. the eternal and infinite knowledge and wisdom power of the Ishvara, the consciousness force of the self-existent Satchidananda.